She walked into the room like she didn't belong. 12 years old, grieving, determined, and surrounded by men who thought it was all a joke. But what unfolded next silenced every laugh and changed everything they believed about power, promise, and respect. If you've ever been underestimated, or watched someone rise when the odds were against them, this story will stay with you. She walked into the room like she didn't belong there. Not out of a lack of courage. Not out of ignorance about why she was there. But because all the walls, uniforms, and stairs around her were whispering to her in unison that she didn't belong there. She was 12 years old. A kid. But she didn't budge. Not when the men in elaborate uniforms laughed behind whiskey glasses. Not when they muttered, cute, or delusional, under their breath. Not even when the man in the middle of the room, the one with the greatest number of medals, the hardest jaw, and the iciest eyes, laughed in her face. It's so simple to dismiss someone who doesn't fit the part. A little girl, undersized for her age, standing before battle-hardened military men, requesting entry into their hallowed sanctum. But have you ever misjudged someone, only to find, too late, that you weren't seeing weakness, you were seeing unbreakable resolve? This is not a story about a gun. It's not a story about a shooting range. And it's not even, truthfully, about the army. It's about what happens when a promise made at a gravesite burns so hot within a child's heart that it becomes something uncontainable. It's about a girl who learned sorrow before she learned algebra, who practiced in the night, when others slumbered, to preserve the only inheritance she had left. And it's about the risk of underestimating a person because of how he looks, where he is from, or how little he is. Grown-ups do that more often than they should. Have you ever seen a person enter a space that was set up to exclude them, only to own it so thoroughly that it had to be rebranded in their name? Because that's what this tale is. It's a teaching in dignity, in determination, and in the sort of unobtrusive greatness that doesn't have to yell, doesn't ask for attention, simply arrives, does its thing, and alters the landscape. This little girl didn't come to cause a scene. She came to pay respects to a father stolen too early, to keep a vow that no one else had ever heard, and to show that respect isn't something you request. It's something you gain, by doing, not talking, what you're capable of. The man who scoffed at her had no idea. He didn't know what was about to be revealed before his eyes. And neither could the officers who chuckled with him, the veterans who watched nearby, inquisitive but dismissive, or the onlookers who crept up slowly, feeling something out of the ordinary but not quite knowing what they saw. But some things can't be explained ahead of time, they can only be lived, and once lived, never forgotten. This tale will take you inside that moment, not only the shot heard round the field, but the glance that passed between a devastated daughter and the legacy of a father who never lost faith in her. It will demonstrate to you what occurs when excellence is met by disbelief, when quiet talent is met by loud ignorance. And when the strength of preparation is met by a world that doesn't think much of you. It will make you think of the fights so many of us have in secret, the ones that begin with being ignored and ultimately end with redefining what is possible. So, breathe. Let go of what you believe you know about underdogs, about military life, about little girls and what they're supposed to be. Because this isn't a fairy tale. This occurred. And for the individuals who got to see it, it rewrote their definition of what kind of strength really exists. This is the tale of how a 12-year-old girl entered a room. The officers' club at Fort Braxton resounded with laughter, the kind that caused the crystal glasses on mahogany tables to shudder. Colonel Marcus Steele sat back in his leather chair, obviously entertained, his keen blue eyes sparkling with mockery. "You serious, girl?" he inquired, restraining another laugh by inches. Before him stood a 12-year-old girl, alone, small, yet tall. Maya Johnson, her back straight in impeccable military posture like her father had instructed her, held a frayed envelope in her hand. Resting on her chest was a Medal of Honor, her father's. Sergeant David Johnson had been killed 3 years ago in battle, and today, the anniversary of his death, Maya had mustered all of her courage to make this demand. "Sir," she repeated calmly, though her fingers trembled just slightly, "I'd like permission to use the shooting range today. It's the anniversary of my dad's death, and I want to honor him. He taught me to shoot before his last mission. That was the most." Steele couldn't contain it any longer. He laughed so hard he banged his hand on the table, almost spilling everyone's drinks. "Did you all catch that? She thinks she can shoot." The other officers joined in, snickering and whispering to one another. "Shouldn't she be playing with dolls?" Major Thompson grumbled. Captain Williams chimed in with a sneer, "Little girls are in school, not fiddling with rifles." Maya stood firm, face serene, even when the room went against her. She did not flinch. She did not avert her eyes. What they didn't realize, what nobody knew, was that Maya had been secretly trained. After school each afternoon, on weekends, for 6 years, her father had secretly trained her. And not as a game either. David Johnson had been one of the finest shooters the base had ever boasted. His talent was rumored about by elite troopers, though never officially recognized. 3 years before, standing over his grave under a flag of America, Maya had quietly vowed. No one could hear it, but she lugged it around every single day. It seared in her like fire, leading every second that she practiced alone. Colonel Steele emerged from behind his desk, his boots ringing ominously as he strode forward. His lanky frame towered above Maya, casting a long shadow. "Listen here, girl. This is not a playground, kid," Colonel Steele jeered, his voice booming throughout the room. "Guns are not toys, and this base is not where children play at being soldiers. Go home, watch cartoons. Leave the grown-up stuff to the grown-ups." The sting of shame struck Maya hard. Her cheeks burned red, but she didn't crumble. She breathed, a slow, steady one, exactly as her father had taught her. Not to let rage get the better of her. To discover stillness in the midst of storm. To stand up to disrespect with poise, not fury. She balanced herself, raised her eyes, and answered in firm humility. "If I may, sir, I have complete documentation. I'm under proper supervision, endorsed by the Military Family Affairs Department. All safety protocols are being followed. My request is up to base standards." The ensuing laughter was less this time, trembling, even. Major Peterson, sitting next to Steele, nearly choked on his beverage. The little girl's familiar with the rulebook. That's precious. But when Maya held her ground, something gave way. Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably under the mockery that had escalated. Then she met eyes with Colonel Steele, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his confident sneer. Doubt. Her eyes contained a depth well beyond their years, like she'd weathered storms most adults wouldn't make it through. A strength that couldn't be mocked. Steele attempted to regain, shaking his head theatrically. "Stubborn little creature, aren't you? Fine, let's make a bargain." He leaned forward. "If you hit 3 out of 10 targets at 50 meters, I'll stamp your range past myself. But when you blow it, and you will, and get it out of your system, I demand your promise that you'll leave men with actual careers alone about your fantasies." Maya's heart burned within her, but her expression remained serene. She nodded once. "I accept your offer, sir." She stood there, small as she was physically but firm as stone in personality, before a sea of smirks and derisive laughter. Because none of them knew the truth. Maya was not only present to recall her dad, she was there to fulfill a sacred vow, and turn what would have been the most degrading experience of her short life into one she'd never forget. An event that would leave her name etched in the history of that base, and rattle the pride of men who believed they could break her spirit. If you're already feeling the heartbeat of this story, stay close. Because what happens next will not only break every expectation, it'll prove that courage doesn't come in size. It comes in heart. Colonel Steele smiled wide, like a predator about to enjoy a quick victory. But he had no idea he was walking straight into the most humbling moment of his decorated career. "Perfect," replied Colonel Steele smugly. "Let everyone witness what occurs when someone forgets his place." He got up and flailed dramatically toward the others. "Gentlemen, let's take a stroll to the firing range and observe a child get a taste of reality." Major Thompson stood up, rubbing his hands together as if he were getting ready for a performance. "This is going to be more exciting than a film," he laughed. "She'll be in tears before she even lifts the gun." The room erupted in laughter once more, sneering, vicious, like a pack of hyenas. Their remarks trailed behind Maya as they walked down the base corridors, loud enough for her to hear. "She'll pass out at the first shot," Captain Williams grumbled to another officer. "Or cry for mommy," another added. Maya remained silent. What they didn't realize was that this firing range wasn't familiar to her. It was holy turf. For 3 years after her father's death, she had secretly gone to this exact spot each Saturday morning at dawn, when the rest of the base was still in slumber. A maintenance man, an old war veteran who had fought alongside her father, would silently open the gate for her, respecting a bond that did not require words. When they arrived in the range, Colonel Steele gestured toward a table covered in issue guns. "Choose your instrument of humiliation," he mocked. "May I recommend the lightest one? You might at least be able to grip it without dropping it." Maya walked to the table with calm, measured steps. Her fingers gently moved over the weapons until they stopped on a Glock 19, the exact pistol her father had first taught her to use when she was just 7 years old. Interesting choice, Steele said, raising an eyebrow. Well, at least you've got good taste when it comes to failing with flair. His joke brought another laugh, but this time, several of the soldiers on the sidelines weren't laughing. A couple of them shifted uncomfortably, their faces contemplative. Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's weapons instructor, hesitantly stepped forward. He'd served with David Johnson. He knew the type of soldier David had been, and how serious he'd been about marksmanship. Colonel, Rodriguez whispered, perhaps we should have more oversight because she's a juvenile. Nonsense, Steele barked. She wants to be a soldier. Let her. No training wheels. No hand-holding. There was an edge to Steele's voice that unsettled even some of his own officers. Maya, however, worked the Glock with practiced ease. She cleared the chamber, popped out the magazine, tried the slide and trigger, each motion slick and rehearsed, as if she'd practiced it 1,000 times. Rodriguez flinched in surprise, his eyes on her. Well, Steele sneered, his voice pleased. Looks like Daddy did manage to school you a few tricks. At least before he wasn't around to keep you safe anymore. That final sentence stung deep. A cold insult at the expense of her father's death. Maya could feel her blood boil, but her features remained smooth, expressionless, just like her father had instilled in her. Then something changed, silently, but unmistakably. Maya shut her eyes. And when she opened them again, the anxious little girl was gone. In her place stood a different person, unfazed, intense, quietly commanding. Ready when you are, she said. The tone of her voice surprised more than a few of the men standing there. Cold, calm, the same voice they'd heard coming out of battle-hardened soldiers before entering harm's way. A few of the veterans shot each other a look of recognition. They knew that tone. Colonel Steele stood behind Maya, arms folded, smiling like a man who was sure he was in for someone else's downfall. His officers hung around him, betting behind their hands on how many she'd shoot wide. All right then, Steele said. 10 shots. Targets 50 meters away. You need only 3 to win our little wager. Easy for someone with such impressive family training. What they didn't know, what no one of them knew, was that David Johnson hadn't been only a good shooter. He had been the shooter. The reserve master others turned to when their lives were on the line, when their target had to be hit. The guy unofficially coaching the top shooters on base, molding them with the same precision and time he had dedicated to his daughter. And Maya had learned it all. Each lesson, each method, each infinitesimal movement he'd ever breathed over her shoulder, correcting her arms. She'd internalized his instruction and molded it into muscle memory, into 4,847 hours of training over 3 quiet, resolute years. Weekends, holidays, early mornings when the world slept, all for one reason, to do justice to her father not in tears, but in perfection. As she seated herself on the range, the atmosphere shifted, the wind grew quiet, even the laughter faded. There was something about having her around now that disturbed, not that she was boisterous or rebellious, but because she was silent, too silent. Steele shifted uncomfortably, suddenly questioning why he felt so ill at ease. The bravado that had cocooned him like armor felt more fragile now, fractured. Every sneer from the officers, every hissed insult, it didn't crack Maya. It constructed her. Inwardly, unseen, like pressure creating a diamond. They were humiliating her. They had no notion they were getting her ready to win. Maya stepped into shooting stance with steps so smooth, so deliberate, that Sergeant Rodriguez raised his brow. There was something unsettling familiar about her stance. Feet precisely placed, back straight, relaxed but tight arms, breathing steady, loose shoulders. It was seeing a ghost, David Johnson reborn in small. What's the delay, little girl? Steele taunted, his tone smug and echoing. Need somebody to hold the gun for you, or point the target out. There was another laughter round, but it was more hollow this time. Maya didn't respond. She did what she had learned from her father every time they practiced instead. She closed her eyes, took one long breath. Feel the breeze. Hear the quiet between your beats. Perfection occurs in that instant of quiet. Maya's father's words haunted her head like a mantra she had repeated 1,000 times. And when she opened her eyes once more, the atmosphere had changed. Soldiers passing by froze mid-stride. Not the ring of bullets that halted them, it was the aura emanating from that firing line. Something about that girl who stood there with steady, calm hands. As though the wind itself was holding its breath on her behalf. Ready when you give the word, Maya declared, and her voice conveyed a weird, unbreakable calm that created a tiny ripple of apprehension in Colonel Steele. Then came Sergeant Rodriguez, softly but firmly. He was not your typical instructor. 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and serving under David Johnson on one of the most perilous missions of his career had made him a seasoned veteran. And he saw something the others did not. The girl before him was not merely a child with a dream, she was the product of intentional training by the best. Colonel, Rodriguez replied, respectfully but firmly, I think we should give everyone on hand proper hearing protection. For safety, just in case. Steele rolled his eyes. Sergeant, it's 10 rounds from a nervous kid. We don't need full military procedure to observe a guy fail. Rodriguez didn't dispute. He simply nodded and took his place close to the girl, close enough to jump in if something went wrong. But in his gut, he wasn't concerned for Maya. He was concerned for the men who believed this was going to be a joke. Because he knew. David Johnson hadn't just trained Maya, he had passed on the techniques that shaped the base's most elite shooters. Secrets that never made it into manuals, but saved lives in combat. All right, little girl, Steele announced with a theatrical grin. You've got 60 seconds for 10 shots. Starting now. Crack. Maya's first shot echoed across the range, sharp and perfectly placed. Crack. Before the echo of the first had even vanished, the second resounded. The cadence was foreboding, not hasty, but calculated. Every shot precisely timed, as if part of a practice drill. Close-by veterans who had actually fought cringed at the familiar beat. Rodriguez raised his binoculars to the target and gazed in awe as bullets hit their mark. His own breath stopped in his throat. Oh my God, he breathed. She's better than her father. Steele was still laughing, and his laugh had a forced quality now. Something was not adding up. The report of those shots, that control. It was not the picture of a child stumbling around at a fantasy. At least she's fast, Major Thompson said, still attempting to smirk. Perhaps she just wants to get the humiliation out of the way. But they lacked the truth. This wasn't chance. This was a girl who had devoted the past 3 years to converting her sorrow into rigor. Who didn't merely practice, she studied. Every gasp, every gap between heartbeats, every snap of the wrist that her father had ever instructed her in was a part of her now. For 1095 dawns, Maya had risen before dawn. At 5 o'clock on the dot. Rain or shine, Saturday or Monday, she'd gone out to that improvised range in the back of her house. Paper targets on trees, wind blowing, memory in her hands. And every shot she took was a dialogue with her father. What they didn't know was that Maya hadn't simply trained her hands. She'd trained her mind. In the past 3 years, she'd worked in secret, committing more than 800 hours of mental conditioning, visualization, control of breath, deep focus exercises her father had learned from sniper school, techniques designed to allow soldiers to remain level-headed when they were shooting at them. And Maya had learned them years and years sooner than anyone could have believed. Shots 4, 5, and 6 echoed like clockwork, clean, crisp, perfect. Now, the whispers started. The bitter laughter that had filled the range just minutes earlier was dissipating, to be replaced by hushed whispers and sideways looks. Even the cockiest officers were beginning to look uncertain. It's taking too long to test the target, Captain Williams grumbled beneath his breath, the haughtiness leaking from his tone. But Rodriguez knew why nobody was racing to check the board. Because those noises, that sharp metallic ping, only occurred when a bullet landed dead center on the steel target. And Maya had struck it more than once. Still steady and deliberate, Maya fired shot 7, then 8. Steele's smile wilted. The laughter ceased altogether. And when Maya stood up to shoot her 9th, an expectant silence settled on the crowd. As if everyone knew intuitively, this was no longer about making a point. Something is happening here that they haven't seen before. Then the 10th shot. But first, Maya did something extraordinary. She subtly shifted position. A tiny adjustment of her angle, enough to counter a blast of wind that the rest of the world had ignored. Rodriguez noticed. That reflexive adjustment, it wasn't chance. It was the sort of action only genuine experts, high-level marksmen, performed without conscious thought. The sort of reflex developed through repetition over years, not one you taught in one lesson. The final shot resonated out over the field like the period at the end of a dominating sentence. Maya took her time bringing down the Glock, engaged the safety with practiced smoothness, and turned to regard Colonel Steele, her face serene, her voice firm. 10 shots complete as requested, sir. Colonel Steele had nothing to say for the first time that day. There was no grin, no smart alecky zing. Because something about Maya's unassuming surety made him uneasy. It didn't fit the script he'd been constructing. The humiliation he'd expected to see unfold had somehow turned around, and he knew it. Rodriguez moved forward with his high-powered binoculars. The crowd held its collective breath. He'd seen a lot of shooters over the years, some great, some legendary, but this did not feel right. It felt like history was being remade. And as he focused on the target, his face altered. The sort of response that sweeps through a room without a word. Something on his face caused even steel to shift uneasily. For at that point, everyone felt as though the truth was going to drop like a bomb. Time seemed to have frozen. Sergeant Rodriguez continued to stare through the binoculars like what he was witnessing couldn't be explained, even to a man who had served in some of the most treacherous parts of the planet. He didn't stir, didn't say a word. The silence after Maya's last shot was so profound that you could have heard the flags waving in the wind. Then, gradually, his face changed, from curiosity, to incredulity, and finally, to something almost like awe. "Sergeant Rodriguez?" Steele asked, attempting to sound nonchalant, but there was a new tension in his voice, tight, uneasy. "Well, let's get on with educating this little girl about the real world." Rodriguez finally lowered the binoculars, his face white. He didn't reply immediately, he just stared at Maya, and for a second he almost looked too afraid to talk. "Colonel," he started, clearing his throat, "you ought to see it." Steele scowled. "What? How many did she hit? 5, 6. He was attempting to laugh, but his voice cracked with the adrenaline of one who knew something was extremely wrong. Rodriguez extended the binoculars, his hand shaking. "Sir, all 10. But, you have to see it for yourself." Steele grabbed the binoculars, attempting to get back in charge. But the instant he scoped in on the target 50 meters away, his face went white. His bluster disintegrated. What he saw didn't just disappoint his expectations, it shattered his faith in what was possible at all. All 10 had landed dead center, not only on the target, but in a cluster so precise, they'd created what appeared to be one hole. It was the type of accuracy that snipers work for years to accomplish. And it had just been accomplished, by a 12-year-old girl. That's impossible," he said, squinting and readjusting the lens again. "It's a glitch. A flaw in the scope, perhaps. Something." But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't a trick. There was no mistake. Maya had done precisely what she had come to do. She did not gloat, did not smirk. She merely stood in silence, the epitome of calm strength. Her face unchanging, as if she were grasping not merely her gun, but the truth. Major Thompson moved forward, took the binoculars away from Steele's trembling hands, and almost dropped them after glancing. "My God," he breathed, "that's better than anything I've seen in 20 years of active service." One by one, the other officers looked. And one by one, their smug expressions vanished. Even Captain Williams, the one who'd scoffed that little girls should play with dolls, was too stunned to speak. The evidence was right there, in steel and paper. Unarguable. Unbelievable, undeniable. Then Rodriguez came forward again, and in a firm, steady voice that rang across the range, he declared, "Miss Johnson, your father would be the proudest man on earth today." He stood before the officers, no longer sneering, but chastened. "This isn't just a tribute. This sets a new standard of excellence on this base." The words struck like blows. Steele suddenly felt the full impact of what had occurred. He hadn't merely been outshot. He'd openly jeered at the daughter of a deceased soldier with several medals who died on the battlefield. A young woman now standing as the most accurate shooter on the range. And every last soldier witnessed it. Some were already taking covert photos, recording on their phones. The tale would be circulating throughout the base before evening. The pompous colonel embarrassed by a 12-year-old girl, a hero's daughter, to make matters worse. Steele only got his words out after what felt like forever. How can this happen? Maya held his gaze at last, peaceful and tranquil. "My father taught me something," she said softly. "That respect isn't something you command. It's something you gain, through action, not speech. My dad always said," Maya went on, her voice firm and even, "when someone judges you based on what you look like, where you're from, the best response is to demonstrate to them what you can do." She didn't tell him angrily. She told him like a fact she'd been carrying around for years. And somehow, that made it hit even harder. Grown men, officers who were meant to be her heroes, remained silent, outmatched not only by her abilities, but by her dignity. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, obviously shaken. "Miss Johnson," he started, "your dad used to tell me you were gifted, but, he never mentioned how talented." He was silent for a moment, thinking, would you be willing to attempt a greater distance? Just to test. Maya's face brightened. "What are you thinking, Sergeant? 100 meters? 200? You name the distance." Colonel Steele remained in the background, his gut knotted. He had hoped it would be over after round 1. But it wasn't over, it was only the beginning. This little girl, whom he'd ridiculed in front of his peers, wasn't just making her point. She was undoing the poisonous pride and prejudice that had excluded people like her from places like this for far too long. More troops were arriving now. Rumor had spread around the base like fire. Something incredible was taking place at the range. Veterans who had battled in war zones strolled up, not to stare, but to see. And what they witnessed was nothing less than history in the making. Maya precisely rechecked her firearm again, swift, smooth, masterful. The difference between her elegant professionalism and the fidgety agita of the men who had belittled her mere minutes prior could not have been more stark. Sergeant Rodriguez, she spoke softly, 200 meters would be a good place to begin. Steele's face lost all color. He understood then that Maya hadn't just come to film. She'd come to teach perseverance, character, how you treat other people when they don't expect you to come out on top. And he, and every single guy who'd sneered at her, was the reluctant pupil. As the new targets were established farther away, the air pulsed with tension. Would she be able to continue? Was there a limit to this girl's capabilities? And more urgently still, what else could she instruct them all in the ways of courage, determination, and the soft strength of faith? 6 months later, the answer had become apparent. Maya Johnson navigated the same corridors at Fort Braxton, but this time she sported a shiny gold badge on her chest. Junior Precision Marksman Instructor, U.S. Army Exceptional Talent Program. At 13 years of age, she was the youngest individual in American military history to ever hold that rank. That morning on the range, what had been intended to embarrass her, became a moment inscribed into legend. And having scored every target at 200 meters, Maya continued on. 300, 400, 500 meters. And when she made a coin-sized target at half a kilometer, with iron sights alone, adult men sobbed openly. Battle-hardened war veterans wept, not only because of her marksmanship, but because of what she represented. One soldier had recorded the whole demonstration on his phone and quietly posted it. In 2 weeks, the clip had been watched 47 million times. Little Girl Destroys Racist Colonel with Impossible Shot. That was the title, but it was the tale behind it that touched the world. Maya Johnson was a global icon of resilience, testimony that ability, hard work, and integrity have no color. For Colonel Steele, the consequences were immediate. A complete military inquiry confirmed Maya's experience was not unique. Dozens of families spoke up, recounting reports of the same prejudice, the same humiliation. Steele's pictures of him making fun of Maya while she stood in uniform made their way around social media like wildfire. The man who laughed at a legend. That was the caption that was most widely used. He was downgraded, sent to a remote post in Alaska, and assigned a desk job requiring him to give daily reports to Black and Hispanic officers, individuals familiar with his story and who would never forget it. His otherwise promising retirement plan dissolved into a shameful, low-key departure. As for Major Thompson and Captain Williams, they were officially reprimanded and had to undergo weeks of training in racial sensitivity and diversity. Their careers never quite rebounded, but Maya's? Maya flew high. The Pentagon constructed a special course just for her, one that enabled her to stay on to attend regular school while being given sophisticated military training. She was deluged with scholarship grants by leading universities. Major defense industry contractors made overtures to sponsor her development, but the most significant influence couldn't be quantified in medals or accolades. Maya Johnson kindled a fire in the hearts of thousands. Young people who had been informed they didn't fit, girls who had been ridiculed for desiring more, children of color who had been overlooked, addressed condescendingly, or just dismissed. They all noticed Maya, and because of her, they believed in themselves a little more. Letters started coming in from kids all over the nation. Children from low-income areas, from small towns, from communities far too often forgotten. They wrote about how Maya's book caused them to believe in their dreams once more. That if she could accomplish what she did, so could they. Young Black women, particularly, identified with her. They didn't only respect her talent, they respected her courage, her grace, her strength in the midst of blatant disrespect. Maya had demonstrated the world that ability, discipline, and resolve were more powerful than any bias. Sergeant Rodriguez, now officially a staff sergeant for his integrity and leadership throughout the incident, took on Maya as his mentor. He stood by her side frequently as she trained new recruits, young soldiers who hung on her words as if she were a legend personified. Your dad would be swelling with pride, Rodriguez told her one afternoon, observing her provide tips to a group of flabbergasted cadets. But I think he'd be even more proud of the woman of integrity you're turning into. The range where it all began, the firing range, was renamed in David Johnson's honor, the David Johnson Shooting Range. A bronze plate was installed by the entrance. It narrated the story of one unforgettable day, a day that turned everything around. A day when a little girl stood firm and showed grown men what real excellence is all about. And Maya still went to her father's gravesite every Saturday. But the trips were no longer the same. She no longer cried. She spoke with him, told him about her week, about the new recruits she'd trained, the records she'd shattered, the children she'd inspired, the limits she'd pushed a little farther. And before she left, she always whispered the same thing. I did it, Dad. I showed them what we're capable of. Fort Braxton was never the same. New zero-tolerance policies against discrimination. Talent outreach programs in underserved populations became a priority. And Maya's tale, it was shared in every leadership training session, not just as a reminder of what occurred, but as a warning. Prejudice blinds us to potential. The most ironic thing, Colonel Steele's scheme to humiliate Maya had backfired so beautifully, it was poetic. Rather than breaking her, he had given her the platform, with a front-row seat of officers, soldiers, and veterans who would take her tale with them wherever they went. His public effort to break her was the very stage on which she stood tall. 6 months had passed before Maya received an invitation to give an interview on national television. When asked whether she bore any grudge towards the man who ridiculed her so viciously, her reply astonished the world. He gave me the biggest gift anyone could have given me, she whispered. He gave me the opportunity to show him. Sometimes the toughest critics become our greatest teachers, even if they never intended to. And in that one moment, Maya Johnson once again demonstrated why she was truly remarkable. She discovered the most valuable lesson of all. The best revenge is not to ruin those who seek to tear you down. It's to be so remarkable, success is impossible to overlook. Maya had transformed pain into purpose, transformed insult into flame, and converted one act of dismissal to a narrative that would inspire millions. The little girl who once waited in a room of officers to be granted permission to pay tribute to her father was now a force of nature, remaking the rules of what people thought was achievable. She reminded the world of one thing we must never forget. Never discount someone because of the way they look. Because the voice that is most quiet in the room may be the one that will alter everything. Sometimes life quietly reminds us that strength doesn't always thunder, it stands firm, holds steady, and rises with elegance when no one is looking. Maya didn't struggle to be noticed. She arrived, stood her ground, and spoke with actions when words would not. And while doing that, she reminded an entire room, possibly even the world, that dignity is not something others give us. It's something we hold within ourselves, even when it's challenged by doubt, cruelty, or silence. We all have our moments of being underestimated, where the burden of our history or the boundaries others set upon us seem impossible to break. But in those moments, what truly sets us free isn't about proving the doubters wrong, it's about holding on to what we know we can do. Maya's life is a whispered invitation to each of us. When the world says, no, to you, sometimes the best response is to just keep showing up, and let your light speak for itself.